Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've been following someone on social media, LinkedIn, who is really interesting in her commentary in regards to the role that women are playing in the war in Ukraine. She is a senior lecturer in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University on the west coast of Wales. Her name is Jenny Mathers. She's an American and grew up in Florida. She's got degrees from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts and Oxford University, and her research and teaching are focused mainly in two areas: Russian politics and security, and women and war. What a fascinating background that you've got, regrettably, for this time that we're in right now. And I've really enjoyed Professor Mathers in listening to and reading some of your commentary. It's been really quite interesting. You've been on lots of different panels and lots of different shows. What is the role of women in the Russian-Ukrainian war right now?
I think it's really fascinating because it's so varied, right? Because women are doing so many different things. And, you know, they're doing different things in Ukraine than they're doing in Russia, for example. And we see really the differences, or I see the differences in the way that the two countries are including women or not including women in certain roles as being really reflective of how those countries' leaderships and societies see themselves. How they see themselves as, what kind of values they have, where they put their emphasis in terms of, men's roles, women's roles, but also, how society should be developed and shaped, whether they're more in favor of traditional social values on the side of Russia, for example, or whether they're really trying to embrace more sort of progressive, liberal values, maybe that are shared more in Western Europe and North America. So I think if you look at the way that women are acting in the war and the way that they're interacting with the armed forces and also the states and the societies that they're in, I think we learn a lot about the war itself and about how those two different societies are approaching it and how they see themselves and their futures.
I want to delve into that in far greater detail, but I guess one of the other things is that, it seems at times when we've seen some of the atrocities that people's attitudes haven't changed for millenniums, that people treat that it would appear that some Russian soldiers have treated women as objects, and that rape as a war effort has been used. Is that not also accurate?
That is absolutely true, and that is a really important dimension to the whole dynamics of this war, because it's really clear that the Russian soldiers have been acting very much on orders, on instructions in the way that they treat the civilian population in Ukraine. And the use of rape and other forms of torture and abuse, particularly against women, is a way of humiliating the population. It's a way of humiliating the men, as well as a way of punishing the women for daring to be Ukrainian, for daring to stand up to the Russians who are trying to conquer them. It's a very, very old way that armies have of imposing their will on civilian societies, on the enemy, basically. And you could go back to really the beginning of recorded warfare, and you find this being used as a way of trying to punish, take revenge upon the civilian society, but also to teach them a lesson, to tell them, know your place. We are the conquerors, and we will do whatever we want to with you. And treating women in this way is part and parcel of that bigger attitude towards conquering the enemy.
Are women at the front line?
Yes, they are. They are definitely at the front line on Ukraine's side, not so much on Russia's side, but definitely on Ukraine's side. Yes.
And do you think that's working? What's the response of Ukrainian men to having women fighting by their side?
I think it's varied. I think what we're learning is that firstly, that Ukraine, like Russia, actually has quite a patriarchal society, and so these kinds of social changes are relatively new, even in Ukraine. And so there is pushback from some of the men, absolutely, and we're certainly getting the sense of that from women who are currently serving in the military, and the way that they are kind of reporting things back through private channels. But I think increasingly the men are are recognizing the value of what the women are bringing in terms of skills. A lot of them are medics, in fact, which are desperately needed, in this war, which has been so very damaging and has caused so many casualties. But whatever role they're serving in, they seem to be increasingly gaining the respect of their male colleagues and gaining the respect of Ukrainian society and also the respect of the political leaders in the country. So more and more recognition for the fact that they're making the sacrifice, they're putting themselves forward, they're volunteering to serve their countries and to try and defend it.
You've been very vocal on numerous different issues in regards to the war, but numerous other females have as well. And I think that's one other interesting fact is that there's numerous female war correspondents that reporters and columnists and people, females right on the front line that we've seen reporting. Is that a difference too?
I think it's something that has been developing over a period of time. I think journalism is still quite male dominated, and especially the role of the war correspondent, especially is very male dominated as well. But nevertheless, I think we're seeing more and more women, demanding those opportunities, demonstrating that they can make the most of them, and drawing upon experience that they have gained over a number of years, and unfortunately over a number of wars, whether it's covering, Syria, whether it's covering wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, or further back as well. So, we're seeing a lot of experienced, I think, women journalists covering this war, as well as some of the younger ones.
Politics also is a little bit different. The head of the European Union, the role that President Zelensky's wife has been playing, some of the senior females in the American diplomatic corps and government. Is that different too?
I think we're seeing sort of a development of women's roles at the level of diplomacy, at the level of the highest sort of reaches of politics. And this is something which has been happening over a period of time. I don't think it's irreversible. I mean, these things can go backwards as well, but we are seeing, step by step, some developments in that area. And it's becoming, I think, a little bit more normal to see women in these kinds of roles. And it's not quite so surprising as it used to be perhaps 10, 20 years ago. It's more accepted. And, the women are finding it perhaps a little bit easier to just get on and do the jobs as professionals rather than always having to sort of prove themselves and to overcome the shock of others that they're actually there in the room, doing that work.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more with Jenny Mathers and talk a little bit more about her background, about the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion. We're going to talk a little bit more about the atrocities. We're going to talk a little bit more about females on the front line. Stay with us, everyone. I think this will be an interesting conversation tonight. Stay with us. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Jenny Mathers. She's an expert on and a senior lecturer in issues in regards to women and politics in Russia and the war in Ukraine. Jenny is a senior lecturer in the Department of International Politics at, I'm going to get this wrong, I apologize, Aberystwyth University on the west coast of Wales. She is an American, grew up in Florida, has degrees from Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts and Oxford University. And as I mentioned, her research and teaching are focused on Russian politics and security and women in war. I've got to ask you, how did you get interested in Russian politics and security and women and war?
Yeah, okay. So on the Russia side, it goes back a very long way, actually. When I was growing up in the United States, in Florida, during the Cold War, we had to take a compulsory course in high school called Americanism versus Communism. And it was just as blatant as that, Americanism versus communism. And the idea was to try and open up the eyes of young American teenagers to the evils of communism. So we looked at Soviet Russia, and we looked at communist China, and compared those to the values of American democracy. But I'm afraid the course had maybe the opposite impact on me in that it spawned a lifelong interest in Russia and a real fascination, possibly in part because it's such a different climate, cold and snow and ice and all these kinds of things. But something about the country and the politics just really sparked my imagination. And I started studying Russian language when I went to college, and Russian politics and history. And I carried on doing that and did a master's and a PhD. And that's kind of where my interest has really stayed focused, is largely on Russia, trying to understand this country, this political system, which is so different from the one that I grew up in, and trying to make sense of it.
How has Russian politics changed? We had the Cold War, we had the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had Gorbachev and Glasnost. Where do you think that train of the progress or change of Russian politics is today?
I think we've gone backwards a long way. I mean, when I was in college and doing my postgraduate work was when Gorbachev was bringing change, basically. So during the Gorbachev years. And when I first started my academic job, it was during the start of the Yeltsin years and the start of the 1990s. And that time was a real time of opportunity and change. I mean, I think Gorbachev himself didn't realize quite how much change he unleashed when he started making changes and introducing perestroika and glasnost and so on. But opening up the society to ideas and opening up the possibility that ordinary people could speak their own minds was really new in the Soviet system. It was totally new, and it was really frightening for a lot of the political leaders. And so it turned into a sort of developments and went in different directions that the leadership just couldn't control. And when Gorbachev tried to rein it all back again towards the end of his period as leader, things just fell apart, and he wasn't able to do that. When we get to the 1990s, we have a time, again, with a lot of potential. And there was so much expectation. I lived in Russia in the early 1990s, and there was so much expectation, both on the side of Russians and on the side, certainly, of Americans and other people from Western countries, that Russia would at last be able to shake off the control of the Communist Party and be able to really join the West in a way, join the international community, become its own country, become prosperous, become democratic. But nobody understood the scale of the issues and the scale of the problems that would have to be overcome and the degree of change that would be needed. And so that hope, I'm afraid, very quickly kind of disappeared and became very cynical. And so today, what you have is you have a leader in Putin who uses the 1990s as an example of all the bad things that democracy can bring, inflation, unemployment, instability, insecurity, weakness. This is sort of how he portrays that time. And, the answer to that he gives is, well, we have to have a strong state. We have to have a strong leader. We have to crack down on opposition. We have to have a strong military. And, increasingly his world and the world of Russia itself is becoming smaller and smaller, because it's becoming much more inwardly focused and much more focused on trying to maintain power and control and trying to really stamp out any kind of opposing voices or critical voices or even questioning voices. So I think, it's been very, very upsetting and disappointing, really. I mean, in a very minor way in comparison to all the great loss and tragedy of the war, but to see Russia going backwards and going down this path, which I had hoped it had left behind, but clearly it has not.
I think it's a little ironic, isn't it, that it was Yeltsin and the president of Ukraine at the time that phoned up Gorbachev and told him that the USSR was no longer. In Russia, they've seen the progress of East Germany, of Poland, of the Baltic states, of Ukraine. And certainly some people think that he didn't want to have a successful democratic state on its neighbor, in its neighbor, Ukraine. But do you think the people of Russia are aware of how countries that they used to be aligned with have gone democratic and have prospered?
I think it depends. I think, Russia is a big society. And there are some people who are in Russia who are very well aware of it. Of course, many of those people have left. Many of those are no longer in Russia because they object to the war so violently that they had to leave. But I think a lot of ordinary Russians who haven't had the opportunity to travel, for example, to see how different life can be in other places for themselves, they're not very prosperous. They maybe don't have the the incentive or the desire to look beyond what the Russian state media is telling them, those people probably have no idea. And indeed, we have, evidence in the sense of testimony from Ukrainians who survived Russian occupation in Ukraine, saying, many of the Russian soldiers would come into their homes, burst into their homes and sort of steal things and rough them up. But the Russian soldiers were shocked at how well the Ukrainians were living. And, these were not people who were particularly rich. They were just living an ordinary kind of middle-class life. They had a washing machine, they had a tumble dryer, this kind of thing. They had these little, things that we take for granted, really, in most Western countries. And so I don't think a lot of ordinary Russians have understood quite how much, democracy and economic development in these other countries, which they used to be aligned to, has really left Russia behind.
I'm not sure if you have any relatives or friends in Canada, but the statistic I think is that 1 in 4 Canadians has a blood relative living in the United States. I've got relatives in Florida, probably living close to where you were, and throughout the United States, as an example. My understanding is that the statistic between Ukraine and Russia is similar, that 1 in 4 Ukrainians has a blood relative living across the border in Russia. How did this happen between these two peoples that were so close?
Well, I think since the collapse of the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1990s, you've had parts of what were the Soviet Union becoming independent, like Ukraine, like Russia, and going in very different directions in some cases. So Ukrainian society had its own history and its own identity long before the Soviet Union ever came along, hundreds of years of culture and history and so on in Ukraine. But certainly since the 1990s, the early 1990s, Ukrainian society, civil society has developed and become very strong. It's become increasingly independent from the state, increasingly critical of the state, increasingly willing to go out onto the streets when the leaders of the state don't fulfill their electoral mandates, when the leaders of the state prove to be corrupt and are taking the country in a direction they don't want to go in. And so the Ukraine has had 2 revolutions. It's had the revolution of 2004, which was the Orange Revolution, when they were objecting to rigged elections and demanding fresh elections be run fairly and freely. And they had the revolution, the Maidan Revolution, Revolution of Dignity in 2013, 2014, when they objected to the fact that President Yanukovych basically went back on his electoral mandate and pledges to move Ukraine closer to the European Union, and decided instead to move Ukraine economically closer to Russia. And they were also outraged at the corruption and all of the incompetence of the Yanukovych regime. So you have a civil society in Ukraine which is very conscious of its own rights, if you like, and very willing to exercise them and to demand that democracy is actually enacted. Whereas in Russia, civil society has really struggled. And in Russia, the state has become very, very powerful. It's become very centralized. It has strengthened itself also through a close alignment with the security forces. So intelligence services, armed forces, other kinds of security forces. There's been a much more sort of centralized political system, especially since Putin first became president back in 2000. And that sort of vertical, power vertical, as it's sometimes called, the strengthening of the centralized system has really been, consolidated over time. And certainly since Putin has returned to the presidency in 2012, he's taken enormous steps to create new legislation, to make it much more difficult to be in opposition, created, much greater legal hurdles towards non-governmental organizations, or effectively towards civil society groups, made it much harder for them to operate. And, more recently has basically just been banning them entirely and completely kind of destroyed the independent Russian media. Whereas in Ukraine, there's been an independent media and there's been an independent sort of NGO sector and so on. So you have 2 countries which have been in the past very closely aligned, which have, intertwined histories, absolutely, and families. A lot of, as you said, a lot of families have those personal connections. But nevertheless, the political systems and the societies of those 2 countries have moved in very different directions for the last 30 years. And now I think we're seeing just how different they are by the way that the societies are responding to this war, how they are reacting and how the political systems of the two countries, are articulating their demands and their perceptions of what might happen as a result of the war, and why they want to win, or why they think it's important for them to win.
Can you explain to me, and maybe it's not explainable, but try, how can soldiers be ordered to rape? How can they actually be interested in carrying out those orders? How can people in today's world, today's societies, actually do that? It seems so barbaric. It seems so, 1,000 years ago. How can that happen?
It seems 1,000 years ago, but I think it happens through various mechanisms. We saw it certainly in the 1990s in the wars of the former Yugoslavia. We saw rape being used as a very intense and purposeful tool to try and humiliate and punish the other society. So it comes through a whole range of mechanisms. It comes through creating hatred of the other society, right? The enemy. The enemy is the other. The enemy is not human anymore. And this is where the rhetoric of the Kremlin and their narratives over the past, nearly 10 years since 2014 comes into play, because ever since the annexation of Crimea and the start of the war in the Donbass in 2014, Putin and other officials and the Russian media have been pushing the story that actually Ukraine is governed by Nazis, by far-right extremist nationalists who have evil designs, who are the heirs of Hitler and the heirs of an actual Ukrainian nationalist called Stepan Bandera, and that they have evil designs basically, and they're evil people. And now, of course, when the Russian soldiers go to Ukraine, we know from what the Ukrainian civilians who've survived occupation tell us that the Russian soldiers have often said, we're here to liberate you, we're here to save you from the Nazis. And the Ukrainians say, well, there aren't any Nazis, go away, we don't want you here. And they just can't quite believe it. So this is building up hatred, building up fear over a period of time in a very systematic way to justify these really extreme and brutal measures. So I think that's a really important part of it. But of course, also, militaries are based on, the use of force, clearly, and sort of strength and purpose and so on. But if that strength and that purpose is directed in a particularly, negative direction, then all of the training, all of the military might, all of the attitudes of attacking are channeled in that direction as well. And so if soldiers are told, what, these women deserve it, they support the Nazis, go for it, punish them. And we know from some of the intercepted recordings between Russian soldiers phoning their wives, a Russian soldier definitely was recorded saying to his wife, I'm in Ukraine and I'm going to rape these women. And his wife is saying, yeah, they deserve it. You do it. Just use a condom so I don't get, a sexually transmitted disease when you get back. So this attitude of hatred and this attitude that, the enemy deserves anything and that rape is the worst thing that can happen to a woman, all of these kinds of attitudes are mixed together. And then when soldiers are in this situation and their commanders are saying, yeah, go and punish the civilian population, they deserve it, then this is what you get on a very large scale.
That's astounding. We're going to take a break for some messages. We'll be back in 2 minutes with Jenny Mathers, a senior lecturer in what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, women's studies, politics, etc. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Our topic tonight is the Russian invasion of and war in Ukraine, and interesting, the role primarily that females are playing in that war. Our guest is Jenny Mather. She's a senior lecturer in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University in Wales. You have been invited to advise different policy communities in the UK, the US, the Portuguese Ministry of Defense, and the United Nations, which sounds kind of interesting. And you've published on Russian foreign and security policy. And I really want to talk about this because you've actually talked about the Russian war in Chechnya, but also Russian nuclear strategy, which I'd like to touch on. And you're currently working, I understand, on 3 projects relating to the war in Ukraine: the militarization of Russia's children, Russian soldiers' mothers and their relationship with the Russian state, and a book examining Russia's war in Ukraine from the perspective of feminist security studies. What are feminist security studies?
Right. So feminist security studies has been around, I guess, for about 40 years, actually. It's something that started within the academic discipline of international relations and the study of security, when more and more feminist scholars, mainly women, but some men, started asking questions about, well, what really does security mean from the perspective of women and other people who are marginalized? We understand what security means from the perspective of presidents and prime ministers and military leaders and diplomats. And that's the level at which security is often analyzed, at a sort of high level. But what does it mean if you bring a gendered lens into this? And what kinds of issues might you be opening up? And so we look at, in feminist security studies, we look at a whole wide range of different issues. We often look at security from the ground up. So, for example, we were just speaking about the role of rape in war, and that has been a focus, absolutely, of feminist security studies, understanding this dynamic and why this happens, and then what happens to women who've been raped after the war. You know, how do they manage to carry on with their lives? How do their communities sort of accept them? What kind of personal security can they find? Feminist security studies can also look at issues around economic security, for example. Are there policies that states introduce that systematically favor or discriminate against women or men, for example? So, you know, where is the burden of austerity policy, for example? In the UK, where I live, you know, when public services get cut back, who has to pick up the pieces? Who has to try and hold everything together? Well, very often it's the women, it's the mothers, it's the wives who have responsibilities in the household, who have to look after the children and so on, and have to find ways of sort of coping and making do. So feminist security studies is a very, very broad area, as you might be able to indicate, to see from my examples. But it's basically looking at security from the perspective of gender and feminism and women, but also other marginalized communities.
I understand that the Ukrainian government put in place a restriction on males from leaving the country, males of military age, but not in females. Was that the right decision?
That's a good question. It reveals a lot, I think, about the way that the government in Ukraine was thinking about the war. And of course, this was an immediate response, but it's not one that they have retracted. They've maintained this ban on men of fighting age leaving the country unless they get special permission. So it revealed, I think, that you know, the government in Kiev was thinking, okay, we need the men to stay because we're going to need the men to be the soldiers, right? They need to fight. But it wasn't thinking of women along those lines at all, even though women have been in the armed forces of Ukraine for many years and have been playing, you know, increasingly important roles in them since 2014. But nevertheless, it wasn't thinking of women in those roles. It was thinking of women as people who were vulnerable and have to be protected and who might have to flee. And indeed, the vast majority, of course, of refugees and internally displaced people from Ukraine are women. Very often women with young children who fled the war for understandable reasons. But, you know, it reveals a sort of mindset. And I think that mindset is changing up to a point. But I think it's part of a process, a longer term process of change. So while men in Ukraine are not only banned from leaving the country, but they're also subject to conscription, you know, compulsory service, women are not subjected to conscription at the current time. And so the women who are fighting in the Ukrainian military are all there as volunteers.
We've heard lots of media stories about Ukrainian soldiers being trained abroad in England and Canada and in Poland, etc. Are any of those soldiers females?
Some of them have been, yeah, sure. I don't know. I don't have any numbers for you, I'm afraid, but yes, I'm sure that some of them have been. Yeah.
If you know that a prisoner of war might get raped if they're a female, is it humane to send females to the front line?
This is an old kind of argument, and it's interesting because it reveals certain things as well about how we think about these things. Because, of course, male soldiers who are prisoners of war also get raped and abused in other ways. And we don't hear about that as much because of the shame that's attached to it, and because very few men are going to admit that this happened to them, but we know that it happens. So rape is a way of inflicting violence on another person, which is also about shame and humiliation and showing an exercise of power over that person. And so it very often happens with men exercising that power over women, but it can happen with men exercising it over other men. So in and of itself, it doesn't seem to me to be a great reason to stop a woman from taking up arms to defend her own country if she chooses to do that, or if she is drafted, if the state is exercising the conscription of women. I think that it's a right and an obligation that many women choose to take up, and I think that there are a lot of what ifs in the world, what might happen. But I think that if we allow that to be a reason for preventing women from serving in militaries, then it opens a whole lot of doors about, well, what else should they be prevented from doing? So, soldiers get trained, soldiers understand the risks that they face. And, there are unfortunately, many risks that they face, both male and female.
In what you wrote me before the show, you said that there was an issue in regards to women veterans that they face after they've served. What's the specific issue there?
Well, I think this is, again, this is an issue which women veterans face much more widely around the world, is just the very fact that many societies, even societies where women have been serving in militaries for generations, like Canada, like the US, still a lot of veteran services are not actually designed with women in mind. And so women find it difficult sometimes to access those services. They find it difficult to be accepted back into civilian society as veterans. So you have, civilian services for women not being designed for veterans, veteran services being designed for men. They fall in this uncomfortable gap. So many women, and this is what my Ukrainian colleagues who were researching with Ukrainian women's veterans find, is that, women find it really difficult to make that transition back into civilian life, as many male veterans do as well. But I think the expectations of civilian society about women's roles are still very gendered. And so we expect women to have that sort of soft, nurturing, caring dimension to them, that a woman should be able to step back into the household and instantly become, the mother of her children again, and everything like that, as though the war never happened. And I think this is what we're finding Ukrainian women veterans are telling researchers, is that they're finding it particularly difficult with those sort of attitudes of society. As well as attitudes among society more broadly, saying, well, why on earth were you doing this? Why did you choose to go and fight anyway? It's a man's place. It's not your place. So I think there's a whole range of practical as well as maybe more emotional and social reasons why women veterans, especially perhaps in Ukraine, are having a hard time and may have a hard time in the future, even after the war is finished.
You also said that there was a very high proportion of women who had been prisoners of war. Why is that?
I think it's because of the nature of the war and the way that it's being fought. So the two armies are often coming into direct conflict with each other. And Russian forces might be kind of attacking and overrunning a Ukrainian position and then taking everyone prisoner, for example. And in the wars that's certainly the US has been fighting in recent years, there just hasn't been quite so much direct contact between the two opposing armed forces. So you have very few, say, American women veterans who have that experience of having been in captivity, right. Whereas with Ukrainian women, it's becoming much more common.
You say that you studied the war in Chechnya. My understanding is that Russian women, mothers, played a very significant role, both opposing the war in Chechnya as well as the war in Afghanistan. Why aren't they playing a role now? With all the victims, with all the casualties that we understand that have been incurred by Russian forces, why aren't Russian mothers complaining more?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it's one that a lot of us expected Russia's soldiers' mothers to be much more opposed to the war than they have been, and they haven't been. They haven't come out against the war in any sort of numbers. And even the civil society organization called the Committees of Soldiers' Mothers, which are these grassroots organizations that developed during the Soviet war in Afghanistan and really got going during the first war in Chechnya in the 1990s. They became advocates for conscripts. They became advocates for holding the Ministry of Defense to account and trying to even take them to court to make sure that they fulfilled their legal obligations to soldiers and to their families. They became this real sort of campaigning organization, and they haven't come out against the war. So I think there's a number of dynamics going on here. I think to a large extent, what we're seeing is socioeconomic dynamics at work. Because although formally Russia operates a mixed system of conscription and volunteer services, in practice, if you have a bit of money and if you are willing to pay a bribe or to sort of understand a little bit the legal loopholes, you can get out of conscription. But it takes a bit of money and it takes a bit of knowledge. And for a lot of people in Russia who live in the more deprived socioeconomic areas, they don't have the money. They don't have the knowledge, but they also need the money that a soldier's salary would bring to the household. And so there's a real sort of economic need and a real dependence on the state and military service, certainly up until the current war, and maybe in some parts of Russia still is regarded this way. Military service has been regarded as a more honorable kind of a job to go into. If you're a poor Russian teenager from the backwoods, it's a chance for some training, it's a chance for a job, it's a chance for a career, maybe. And it's something, it's not illegal, it's not like becoming involved in criminality or running drugs or right. This kind of thing. So, it's got a certain amount of respectability to it. And so you have a lot of families now in various parts of Russia who are economically tethered to the Ministry of Defense through their sons or their husbands' jobs as soldiers. And so they cannot afford literally to
complain.
The war, to complain. They do complain. It's interesting because although they don't come out and say we're against the war, they do complain to the Ministry of Defense that the Defense Ministry are not preparing their sons and their husbands adequately for the war. And I think this is a really interesting aspect because I think it's an area where the government is vulnerable to that kind of criticism. Because in the September mobilization, the mobilization that Putin announced in September of 300,000 people, they were very, very quick. The authorities were to sort of almost grab people off the streets and rush them through some training and then start sending them to the front line very quickly without adequate training or equipment or uniforms or leadership or any sort of sense of what they were doing. So you had very high casualty rates, and you had a lot of families of these soldiers literally complaining, and sometimes in public, to the Ministry of Defense to say, you're not doing your job. Our sons, our fathers, our husbands are doing their patriotic duty to the state as they were called upon to do, and you haven't fulfilled your side of the bargain. So I think that's actually quite a powerful position, or quite a powerful claim to make against the state. It's not the same as opposing the war. And these mothers and wives, they don't oppose the war for the most part. I think in part because it's quite dangerous to come out and say you're against the war, but also because of this dependency that they have for their very livelihoods. And so they don't oppose it. They also don't seem to take any sort of responsibility for it, and don't seem to acknowledge that their sons and husbands might be responsible for committing these terrible crimes against civilians. It's also much more convenient to believe that your guys are the good guys, isn't it? Yeah. So they haven't been this force for change that we expected them to be, and it's a really interesting and disturbing in many ways dynamic. But I think it reflects a lot of the way that Russian society has developed and the way that the state has increasingly sort of taken control over lots of different aspects of life in Russia.
We're going to take a final break for some messages and be back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes with Jenny Mathers, an expert on Ukraine, Russia, and women in both those countries. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Jenny Mathers. She is a senior lecturer in the Department of International Politics at a university in Wales called Aberystwyth. Is that correct?
Aberystwyth. Good.
Aberystwyth.
Yes.
Whereabouts is that?
It's right on the west coast of Wales. So if you look at Wales on a map and you look at the west coast, it's right in the smack in the middle. So just equidistant from the north and the south. It's a very Welsh-speaking area. So it's an area where a lot of people, speak Welsh as their first language. It's used in the streets. It's used in the shops. It's used in the university. Some of my colleagues teach through the medium of Welsh.
And have you learned Welsh?
I've learned a little bit, but I would struggle to have a very complicated conversation in Welsh.
I gotta ask you. You say one of the things that you're working on right now is militarization of Russian children.
Mm.
When I read that, I sort of got visions of Hitler Youth. What's going on?
It has a lot of similarities, actually, to Hitler Youth. I mean, the particular project I'm working on is with another colleague at Bath University called Alison Edwards, and she and I are really focusing on patriotic youth groups. And these are groups which are created either by the state, in the case of the Youth Army, which is created by the Ministry of Defense, or by people who have close ties to the regime, which the other one is called Victory Volunteers. And what they do is they recruit young people, children from quite a young age up through teenage years, and they have different sort of messages and different focuses. The Youth Army, they're like an army. The kids get this sort of camouflage military uniform, and they wear these red berets, and they march around, and they learn how to fire weapons and march in unison and do various things like that. The Victory Volunteers are much more about commemorating the past and doing nice things for veterans of past wars, particularly the Second World War, but also veterans of other wars. So it's about acknowledging sort of Russia's militarized past, commemorating it, exalting it, and really absorbing those values of, yes, it's normal to dress up in uniform when you're 12 years old and march around and learn how to fire a gun. Yes, it's normal to talk about war all the time. You're not just out there planting flowers in your neighbor's garden because they're elderly and you want to look after them, but because they're war heroes and they're war veterans. And after you plant the flowers, you sit down with them and you hear their stories, and you remember their stories, and you carry those on to the next generation. So I think it's been going on for quite some years now, these organizations, and I think they're really quite a disturbing trend, and it fits together with a lot of other trends like military education in schools, like more and more sort of popular culture focusing on war and the glorification of war. So it's a bigger part of a much bigger picture around militarization of children and young people.
You've published on Russian nuclear strategy. I've got to ask you, do you think Putin is just saber rattling, or is there a real nuclear threat?
I think there's always the possibility when you have nuclear weapons that they will be used. And I think we can't entirely discount that. And I think Putin has made a number of very foolish, wrong-headed decisions over the past year and a bit. And so we can't entirely discount the idea that he will make another foolish decision and choose to use nuclear weapons. But I don't fundamentally think that he will use nuclear weapons. I think the value and the power of nuclear weapons for Putin is in the threat of them, not in the execution, not in the using, right? Because the threat is what keeps people, backed off. The threat of nuclear weapons is what has kept the West quite cautious, really, about how many weapons it provides to Ukraine, what kinds of weapons, where are the red lines, these kinds of questions. It's all about worrying that Putin will decide to use nuclear weapons if he feels backed into a corner. The power for him is the threat to use them. And this is why he keeps reminding us of the fact that he has nuclear weapons and he can use them at every opportunity. This is what he does. And it has been doing, almost ever since he became president. This is the power of nuclear weapons for him. There is really no conceivable military utility for using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Nothing that would really advance Russia's interests militarily. Nothing that's going to fix the problems that they're in. Nothing that's going to allow them to achieve their military goals. In fact, if anything, using nuclear weapons in Ukraine might make the West decide, okay, gloves are off now. He's crossed the line. We can do what we like. he's already done it. There's nothing left to worry about. So I don't honestly think that he will, although I can't entirely rule it out.
You've been studying this war very intently. You've been commenting on it on a fairly regular basis. What do you think is going to happen? Is it going to end?
I hope so. To be honest, I find it very, very difficult to predict the future much further away than a few months. I mean, it's clear in the short term that Ukraine is building up to a major counteroffensive. That's been clear for some time. It's clear that Russia's attempted offensive over the sort of late winter, early spring has not been successful. They've not managed to really achieve very much at all. So I think the Ukrainians will launch their counteroffensive. I think the key problem for Russia is that their armed forces are not as strong as everyone thought that they were, including perhaps Putin. And the difficulties, the weaknesses that are there are so fundamental and they're so structural that they cannot be solved in a short period of time. So I think there is a possibility, and it's maybe a strong possibility, that if Ukraine is able to push back very, very firmly in this counteroffensive, that we will find the Russian forces actually crumbling and falling apart. And I hope that will happen, because that might bring the war to a much quicker end than otherwise would be the case.
Well, this recent commentary that we've heard about the Wagner group saying they might leave their spots because of lack of munitions, I think is potentially an encouraging factor or fact in that base. Jenny Mathers, thank you so much for joining us and talking about these sometimes difficult topics, but also, interesting about the increased role that females are playing in the military in Ukraine, and frankly, not playing in Russia military or Russian society right now. And that's interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You can find me every night at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Wales, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.